Imagine that from one day to the next, a person who has always been there, answering your messages, sharing their days, participating in your routine, simply disappears. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. Suddenly, what once seemed certain begins to throb within you as an absence impossible to ignore. The heart tries to understand what has changed, but the mind knows. Nothing has truly changed. What has changed is the space left behind. It is there, in the void, that presence gains meaning. Carl Jung said that the human psyche reacts to emptiness with the same force with which it fears the unknown. Emptiness is not merely a physical space, but a psychological provocation. It forces the soul to confront something it always avoids, how much it relies on the presence of others to sustain its own sense of existence. The silence of the other becomes a mirror, and in this reflection we discover how much we had become complacent in always having someone nearby. There is something profoundly human in this phenomenon. When presence is constant, we become blind to it. Repetition dims the brilliance, constancy dissolves the value. Jung observed something similar in his patients. People only noticed the importance of a bond when it was broken. The rupture, the separation, the space, all these movements provoked a more intense emotional reaction than years of continuous coexistence. Absence, he said, awakens the sleeping soul. Why do we function this way? Why do we only perceive the value of something when it is taken away from us? Perhaps because human beings need contrast to understand the meaning of things. It is in the dark that we learn to admire the light. It is in solitude that we discover the weight of companionship. It is in the pause that the music becomes complete. Jung saw in this a universal symbolic pattern. The human psyche, according to him, is built around opposites: consciousness and unconsciousness, presence and absence, light and shadow. One only exists because the other gives it form. If we lived eternally under the light, we would lose the ability to see. Absolute clarity blinds. The same happens in human relationships. Constant presence becomes invisible, while absence projects a new way of seeing. Think about the last time someone very close to you was away, even for a short time. Perhaps it was a friend who traveled, a loved one who needed space, or someone who simply decided to disappear. Notice what happened inside you. The memories intensified, the affection was reconfigured, and suddenly even small gestures, a laugh, a message, a glance, gained a value that previously seemed banal. This is the archetypal power of absence. It reorganizes the meaning of what exists. Jung believed that this dynamic is not merely emotional, but profoundly archetypal. That is, it is part of the symbolic structure of the human mind. Since ancient myths, the disappearance of an important figure, the departing hero, the withdrawing god, the silent master, has always been the trigger for transformation. It is in absence that the protagonist discovers himself. It is in silence that consciousness matures. The same thing happens to us. The absence of the other reveals our own incompleteness. It's a reminder that we project onto others what we forget in ourselves. Jung called this psychic projection, the natural tendency to see in the other unrecognized parts of one's own soul. When the other moves away, these parts return inward, and it is in this return that discomfort arises. But there's something even more curious. Absence also awakens the instinct to value something. The less available something becomes, the more importance our mind attributes to it. It's a psychological principle that Jung related to the symbolic notion of scarcity. That which is rare seems sacred. Abundance numbs, limitation awakens. That's why water is only noticed when it's lacking, and love is only recognized when it's gone. What if the same principle applies to our own presence? If scarcity generates value, what happens when we become rare? When we stop being always available? When we stop responding immediately? When we choose silence instead of an automatic response? Jung believed that this transforms the dynamics of any relationship, not through manipulation, but because the unconscious understands absence as a sign of intrinsic value. The psyche associates limitation with importance. He saw this happen in his clinic. Patients who could easily get an appointment often didn't value the process, while those who had to wait for weeks demonstrated a deep commitment to transformation. The effort to achieve something generates emotional involvement, and it is this involvement that creates meaning. When we are always accessible, we remove the effort, and therefore, the symbolic value of the interaction. Ultimately, it's a paradox. The more you give, the less others perceive the giving. Constant generosity is mistaken for obligation. Uninterrupted presence loses its charm and symbolic weight. The human psyche needs movement, proximity and distance, light and shadow, to keep the cycle of appreciation alive. But this doesn't mean we should become cold, calculating, or distant. Jung never advocated emotional detachment. What he revealed is that value doesn't arise from presence itself, but from the balance between presence and absence. It is the space between the two that gives meaning to the relationship. Absence, therefore, is a silent language. It speaks without words. It is a symbolic gesture that communicates, my presence has value. And when this message is understood, the bond doesn't weaken, it matures. The other person begins to realize that access to their presence is not an automatic right, but an experience that requires reciprocity. It is at this moment that respect is born. Jung said that true relationship is not fusion, but dance. And every dance depends on rhythm, pauses, and calculated distances. When two people get too close, their movements become confused. When they move away a little, harmony returns. Absence is the step that allows for reunion. But there's a disturbing detail. Not everyone can tolerate the silence of another. Some people confuse absence with rejection. This happens because, when faced with emptiness, they are forced to confront their own fear of loneliness. Jung saw this as one of the deepest tests of self-knowledge, being able to remain in the presence of one's own silence without running away. Absence, therefore, tests not only our connection with the other person, it tests our relationship with ourselves. It is in the space left by those who depart that we discover how much we depended on the presence of others to avoid looking inward. It is there, in that uncomfortable space, that the individuation process begins. The disappearance of the other can become the gateway back to one's own center. It is when we stop searching outside for what only exists within. Jung believed that every loss is a symbolic invitation to integration, a call to reunite the forgotten parts of the self. What disappears in the external world resurfaces, in the form of reflection within consciousness. But the ego resists. It wants to fill the void quickly. It wants answers, it wants messages, it wants immediate feedback. The ego fears silence because silence dissolves control. And it is at this point that the first major inner conflict occurs. The desire to fill the void versus the need to inhabit it. Modern man, Jung said, suffers because he has lost the ability to remain in the interval. He wants to solve everything, heal everything, understand everything. But the soul does not operate at a pace of urgency. It flourishes in silence. And silence demands absence. What if the true lesson of absence lies not in the one who left, but in the one who stayed? What if absence were not a punishment, but a revelation, a way for the unconscious to remind us that the value of presence only exists when it is chosen, not when it is demanded? Perhaps distancing oneself from the other person is not the end of the connection, but the beginning of awareness. Jung stated that the psyche seeks balance. When something is excessive, whether presence or absence, the unconscious creates compensations. This is why, in relationships saturated by constant cohabitation, an unconscious need for distance arises. The soul asks for space to breathe. The other ceases to be a person and becomes an environment, and the environment ceases to be perceived. Absence, then, acts as purification. It cleanses the excess of noise, of speech, of repetition. It is the moment when the unconscious, free from the overload of stimuli, can reorganize the value of things. Silence is the field where the soul rewrites its hierarchies. But almost no one understands this. People want the comfort of constancy, even if it means the emptying of meaning. They always want to be in contact, even if that contact becomes empty. They want to be remembered all the time, even if it erases the mystery that made them unique. Jung viewed scarcity not as a limitation, but as a source of symbolic energy. What is rare concentrates psychic power. That is why gods hide, masters are silent, and wise men withdraw. Absence is the space where the sacred accumulates. If we applied this to modern life, we would realize how much we have become prisoners of constant presence. Technology has taught us that being present is being connected, but perhaps that is just an illusion. Answering everything and being available to everyone is not synonymous with connection, but rather with dilution. Absence has become taboo, and with it, we have lost the value of waiting. Perhaps the first step in regaining a sense of presence is to rediscover the power of disappearing, not out of indifference but out of wisdom. Disappearing sometimes is the most profound form of presence. It is the silent gesture that communicates, my time has value, my attention is sacred, my absence has meaning. And when this awareness awakens, something changes. Anxiety transforms into calm, the desire for answers gives way to contemplation, and the silence, which once frightened, comes to be understood as the space where the bond is renewed. Carl Jung said that, whatever we disturb in haste, we fail to understand. Absence is an invitation to slow down, to observe, and to return. She doesn't destroy, she reveals. It doesn't break down and it redefines. She doesn't punish, she awakens. What happens when someone who is always there disappears? Perhaps, for the first time, you will see not only who has left, but who you are in their absence. And perhaps the true mystery of presence lies precisely there, in learning to listen to what the silence is trying to say. But what if, deep down, the absence wasn't just about the other person? What if she was revealing something much more intimate, something Jung called imbalance between the outer world and the inner world? What if the disappearance of the other person was a mirror reflecting how much you yourself have disappeared from yourself? These questions cannot be answered in a hurry. They echo silently, preparing the ground for the next discovery, the one that will reveal that value, desire, and respect are born from the same psychological principle, scarcity. And it is at this point that emptiness transforms into a master. Why does what is rare always seem more valuable? Why does the fruit that's high up on the tree seem sweeter than the one that's within easy reach? And why does the love we don't have always seem the most intense? Carl Jung said that human beings are eternal seekers of meaning, and that this search does not stem from satisfaction, but from lack. What motivates us, according to him, is not what we already possess, but what we have not yet achieved. The human soul is made of contrast. It needs distance to feel desire, and scarcity to assign value. When something is too easy, the unconscious interprets it as banal. When it requires effort, sacrifice, or waiting, the symbol gains density, and value is born. This invisible logic is everywhere. In commerce, in art, in relationships, in faith. The entire world is governed by the dynamics of scarcity. And the most curious thing is that it's not just an economic law, but a profound psychological reflection. Think of a jewel. It's not the shine of the gold that makes it precious, but the fact that few possess it. Think of a sold-out ticket, a unique opportunity, a glance given only to you. The value lies in the limitation, the rarity, the effort required to achieve it. The same applies to people. She who is always available becomes invisible. She who is absent with wisdom becomes unforgettable. Jung saw this clearly in his studies of the psyche. He observed that anything that is too abundant loses symbolic meaning. When the unconscious is exposed to something in excess, it ceases to respond. The stimulus ceases to generate emotion. The soul falls asleep. It is scarcity that awakens interest, that creates the flame of attention, that reactivates the instinct of appreciation. But what exactly happens inside us? Why do we react this way? The answer lies in a psychological mechanism known as associating value with effort. Jung described this as a symbolic reflection of the individuation process, the movement by which a human being assigns meaning to that which demands psychic energy. What costs money is worth it. What is given without a fight loses its charm. Think about human relationships. Have you ever met someone who always seemed available, always responding immediately, always offering help, always saying yes? At first it seems charming, but over time, something strange happens. Charm turns into indifference, not because the person has changed, but because our minds begin to take that presence for granted. The human brain is built to conserve attention. That which is always readily available ceases to arouse curiosity. Now think of someone more reserved, someone who answers calmly, who isn't always accessible, who keeps their life moving at its own pace. This person, however discreet they may be, tends to provoke more respect, more interest, more desire. The human mind reacts as if saying, if this person values their own time, there must be something valuable about them. Jung saw this all the time. He said that scarcity is the psychological symbol of value. It's the space that separates the trivial from the essential. What is rare awakens reverence, because it activates in the unconscious the feeling that there is something to be conquered. This explains why people chase after what they don't have, even when they already possess more than they need. Desire is fueled not by possession, but by distance. It is this distance that creates the tension necessary for growth. Desire is the thread that connects the conscious and the unconscious. It moves the individual out of stagnation. But there is an even more intriguing aspect. The principle of scarcity also reveals how much we project onto others the value that we deny ourselves. When someone is selective with their time, the unconscious interprets it as a sign of importance. When someone sets limits, we perceive it as power, and this is not a matter of vanity, but of symbolic language. The unconscious understands limitation as scarcity, and scarcity as value. That is why Jung said, "What we deny ourselves, we value in others." The person who never allows themselves to rest admires those who know how to say no. Those who give of themselves without measure idolize those who know how to protect their own time. That which has no limits creates bonds with those who possess them. Ultimately, every human relationship is also a symbolic exchange of value. When we become overly available, we unconsciously send the message that our time, attention, and even energy are abundant and therefore replaceable. When we set boundaries, the perception changes. Suddenly people organize themselves to fit into the space you define. Scarcity awakens respect, and respect fuels connection. But what happens when this principle is ignored? The modern world is the greatest example of this. We live surrounded by abundance, unlimited information, instant messages, relentless stimulation, and paradoxically, we have never been so empty. Everything is available, and nothing has value. We are surrounded by presences but hungry for meaning. Jung would have called this the symbolic abundance syndrome, when an excess of stimuli erases the value of symbols. When everything is accessible, the unconscious finds no contrast, and without contrast, there is no meaning. Imagine a couple who live glued together without space, without pauses, without mystery. At first it seems intense, almost perfect, but over time saturation sets in. Fascination transforms into routine, interest into habit, desire into boredom. It's not that love has ended, it's that the unconscious has lost the scarcity necessary to perceive the value of presence. Now imagine the same couple learning to respect each other's space, to be absent, to live individual experiences, to preserve an inaccessible part of themselves. Absence here is not a wall, it's a space to breathe, and the reunion becomes a celebration, not a repetition. The same thing happens in any human relationship, romantic, professional, or familial. The friend who responds immediately loses the impact of the word. The employee who says yes to everything is the one who never gets promoted. An artist who is constantly exhibiting their work loses the public's curiosity, and the leader who talks too much stops being listened to. Scarcity, in all its forms, is what keeps value alive. But there is something more subtle and profound here. When we are unable to create scarcity around us, we are revealing something: fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of disappointing, fear of losing love, fear of being replaced. This fear is the root of constant availability, and this fear is precisely what dissolves the respect we so desperately crave. Jung said that the psyche is horrified by emptiness, and therefore tries to fill it with anything: messages, conversations, tasks, noises. But he also said that the soul is nourished by what is rare, by what is expected. While the ego seeks the comfort of continuous presence, the soul seeks the value that only interval offers. This is the central conflict of modern human beings. On one hand, there's the urge to be present all the time, to be seen, remembered, needed. On the other hand, there is an inner need for retreat, silence, pause, distance. It is the same conflict that Jung identified between the ego and the self, between the desire for recognition and the call of individuation. The ego wants to be noticed. The self wants to be whole. The ego seeks abundance. The self seeks meaning. And here's the paradox. The more we try to be seen, the less we become perceived. The more we want to be present, the less we are truly felt. An abundance of presence generates an absence of essence. But how do we balance this in everyday life? How to live between the impulse to give and the need to preserve oneself? Think of something simple. When you respond immediately to every message, you're teaching the other person that your attention has no boundaries, that it can be requested at any time. But when you take your time, when you wait for the right moment, when you respond consciously, communication changes. The pause is part of the message. Scarcity creates intensity. Another example, imagine a professional who is always available. They respond outside of work hours, accept unlimited demands, and try to please everyone. At first, they seem exemplary, but over time, they lose authority. No one respects someone who doesn't respect themselves. Now imagine the one who sets their own hours, who isn't always available, who delivers on their promises, but maintains personal space. This professional, paradoxically, is more admired. Scarcity here is interpreted as power. This isn't manipulation, it's psychology. The human unconscious is sensitive to the symbolic value of absence. Just as gold doesn't need to advertise itself to be precious, a person who values themselves doesn't need to explain themselves to be respected. But there's an even deeper detail. Scarcity is not just a tool of social perception. It is a language that the unconscious uses to teach balance. What is rare forces us to take better care. What is limited attracts attention. And what requires effort educates the soul. Jung saw scarcity as a direct reflection of the individuation process. Becoming whole requires limitation. Humans need to choose what to cultivate and what to let die. In this sense, scarcity is the cradle of discernment. Without it, everything gets mixed up. And when everything has the same value, nothing has any value at all. Therefore, scarcity is not the absence of resources. It is the presence of meaning. She separates the essential from the superfluous, the profound from the superficial, the true from the apparent. But there's a catch here. The modern world has learned to use scarcity as a tool for manipulation, in marketing, on social media, in relationships. What was once a symbol has become a tactic. Limited time promotions, relationships based on games of absence, false urgencies created to awaken desire. And this creates a dangerous inversion. We begin to confuse genuine value with manufactured scarcity. Jung would say that this is the moment when the symbol dies and gives way to the simulacrum, the false sacred, the appearance of depth without essence. True scarcity is not something designed to seduce, but experienced as a natural consequence of authenticity. It is born when a human being understands their own worth and, therefore, protects their energy. Conscious absence is a form of self-love, not manipulation. But what would happen if you applied this principle to your own life? What if you became a little more selective with your time, your words, your presence? What if, instead of always being available, you started being present only when your presence had a purpose? Not only would others change their perception of you, you would change your perception of yourself. Jung said that human beings only discover who they are when they learn to differentiate between what nourishes them and what drains them. Scarcity is the boundary where this differentiation occurs. It forces the being to choose, and choosing is the first act of freedom. Perhaps that's why excess leads to fatigue. The more we have, the less we feel. The more we respond, the less we communicate. The more we show, the less we are seen. Scarcity restores the soul's natural rhythm. It is the space between one breath and the next, the silence between two words, the pause between two presences. She is what prevents love from turning into habit, friendship from becoming convenience, and work from turning into a prison. And perhaps at its core, what we call emotional wisdom is simply this: the ability to choose the right moment to be there and the right moment not to be there. But what if scarcity wasn't just a psychological phenomenon? What if it concealed an older, deeper power, something Jung himself suspected existed, a creative principle of the universe, where emptiness is not absence, but source? This question marks the beginning of the next journey. Because if scarcity gives rise to value, what happens when emptiness itself becomes presence? What is born when silence finally ceases to be the space between things and becomes the thing itself? Have you ever noticed how unsettling silence can be? Just a few seconds without words are enough to make the body restless, the gaze wander, the heart race. Silence strips us bare. It reveals what noise hides. That's why we often prefer noise to presence, movement to pause, distraction to awareness. Carl Jung said that modern man fears emptiness because emptiness forces him to see himself. But what if emptiness wasn't an enemy? What if what we call absence was, in fact, the starting point for something greater? Since ancient times, humankind has sought to fill every void. We build cities on deserts. We speak of silence. We light lamps to dispel the darkness. We fear nothingness. However, Jung saw nothingness as the cradle of all that exists. Emptiness is the womb of creation. It is where consciousness rests before expanding. It is the space where ideas are born, where the soul breathes, where the new can emerge. The problem is that we've been taught to fear this space. We've learned that being silent is being unproductive, that being alone is being wrong, that stopping is synonymous with failure. But the unconscious doesn't follow the rules of the modern world. It needs silence. It needs emptiness to reorganize itself. Just as the body needs sleep, the mind needs absence to dream. Have you ever noticed how the best ideas appear when you're distracted, taking a shower, walking, or staring into space? It's the unconscious in motion. It works when you're quiet. When external noise diminishes, internal voices gain volume. And it's at this point that emptiness ceases to be absence and transforms into revelation. Jung believed that the unconscious doesn't speak in words, but in symbols. And the symbol only appears in silence. It emerges from the space between thoughts, not from an excess of them. Emptiness is the portal through which the unconscious communicates with the conscious. The problem is that few know how to listen. Why do we run away from silence so much? Why are we afraid of emptiness when it is within it that the new is born? Modern human beings live a contradiction. They want peace, but fear the space where it resides. They want clarity, but refuse to slow down enough to see. Jung saw this as a collective symptom. The entire civilization has learned to confuse movement with life, but there is a profound difference between being alive and being busy. According to him, emptiness is not the opposite of life. It is the pause that allows life to renew itself. Just as breathing depends on exhalation, the cycle of existence depends on intervals. Everything that is too continuous loses meaning. Day is only day because night exists. Sound is only sound because silence exists. What if the same applies to us? What if our presence only has value when it is interspersed with pauses, spaces, absence? Think of a painting. What gives shape to the image is not just the colors, but the space between them. The white background is what defines the outline of the figure. In music, notes are not enough. It is the interval between them that creates the rhythm. In life, it's the same. Space is what gives meaning to form. But what happens when we live without space? When do our routines, our relationships, and our minds become saturated with presence, stimulation, and noise? The answer lies in a word that Jung used frequently: inflation. A soul inflated by excess loses its form. When there is no space, the psyche suffocates. An excess of presence, of work, of information, of interaction, causes the same effect as an excess of air in a balloon. It bursts. Therefore, emptiness is essential. It is the antidote to the inflammation of being. But here lies a paradox. The same absence that liberates also frightens. Emptiness can be healing, but it can also be a mirror. When the noise fades, we begin to hear what we've avoided for years. The doubts, the wounds, the inner voices. Jung said that most people can't bear to confront their own unconscious. That's why they fill the silence with anything: social media, conversations, notifications, endless distractions. We flee from emptiness because in it we are forced to confront ourselves. But what happens if, instead of fleeing, we decide to stay? What if, for the first time, we allowed the void to speak to us? He doesn't speak in sentences, but in feelings. At first, there is discomfort. Then, there is clarity. First comes the chaos of internal voices, then the emergence of a new center. Emptiness reorganizes what is inside us. It separates the essential from the noise. Imagine someone sitting before a lake. The surface of the water is agitated, and everything seems murky. If the person waits, if they allow silence, the water calms, and only then does the reflection appear. Emptiness does the same to the mind. It cleans the mirror. But who, today, has the courage to wait for the waters to calm down? Emptiness requires time, and time is what we have the least of. That's why many people live their entire lives without ever finding themselves, because they never spent enough time in silence to hear who they truly are. Jung said that the human soul is like a house with many rooms. Most people live only in the living room, the space of interactions, appearances, and easy conversations. But the real treasure is in the basement. There lie the symbols, the fears, the desires, the forgotten parts of oneself. Emptiness is the staircase that leads there. Those who avoid silence avoid their own depth. Have you ever stopped to think that everything that is truly transformative is born from absence? The seed needs to disappear into the ground before it can sprout. Winter needs to quiet nature before spring arrives. Night must cover the world so that dawn may have meaning. Nothing is born without first dying for a moment. What if the void is this symbolic death? What if it's just the necessary pause for the rebirth of consciousness? Jung believed that the psyche is cyclical. It expands, contracts, retreats, and then returns renewed. When we force a state of constant presence, without pauses, without absences, we break this cycle. We live always in expansion, and we forget about retreat. But all expansion without contraction leads to exhaustion. Emptiness, therefore, is the breath of the soul. Think about the moment before making a big decision. There is a silence, a moment of suspension. It's the void preparing space for the new. Every transformation begins with a pause. But why do we resist it so much? Why do we insist on filling everything, even the space between one thought and another? Because emptiness is a merciless mirror. It shows who you really are when nobody's looking. It shows how you feel when there are no distractions. And it reveals what you've become when the noise dies down. That's why emptiness is feared. It's too honest. Carl Jung viewed emptiness not as an absence of content, but as a potential presence. It is there that the unconscious finds the space to create new symbols. Every dream, every insight, every intuition is born from the same place, inner silence. When we allow space for emptiness, the unconscious begins to work. But what happens when you never offer that space? When the mind is overwhelmed with stimuli, the unconscious loses its channel of communication. Symbolic messages, dreams, intuitions, subtle perceptions become distorted. The result is what Jung called modern neurosis, a constant internal noise accompanied by a feeling of external emptiness. It seems contradictory, but it's not. The more we try to fill our inner selves with external stimuli, the more the emptiness grows. The only antidote is the opposite: to stop, allow space, recognizing emptiness as a natural part of existence. Have you ever wondered why, when you are silent, old memories begin to emerge? Why do forgotten memories return with such force? It's the unconscious reorganizing itself. The void opens the basement doors and allows the psyche to cleanse itself. This process may be uncomfortable, but it is profoundly healing. It is in this space that the soul exhales what was trapped inside and breathes meaning back into it. But emptiness is not just an individual experience. It also has a collective role. Jung believed that entire societies collapse when they lose the symbolic space of silence. When public life is dominated by noise, opinions, urgency, and speed, the collective unconscious becomes ill. And this illness manifests itself in anxiety, intolerance, and hysteria. The same thing happens within each person. An excess of external presence creates an inner void that is impossible to fill. Emptiness is the necessary pause for balance between the outside world and the inner world. Without it, human beings become one-sided, too extroverted, too productive, too communicative, but disconnected from their own center. And what happens when the center is lost? Life goes on, but without direction. Decisions become automatic, words lose their weight, and relationships become superficial. Everything seems to exist, but nothing is felt. Emptiness, paradoxically, is the only way back to meaning. It is a return to the original state, to the silence before the word, to the darkness before the light, to the space before the form. It is the place where the being can finally hear itself without interference. But to get there, you have to overcome your fear. The fear of being alone, the fear of not being noticed, the fear of disappearing. And Jung said that it is precisely by overcoming this fear that consciousness expands. The absence that seemed like a loss reveals itself to be a presence. Then a new understanding emerges. Emptiness is not the end. It is the origin. It is the field where the unconscious plants the seeds of what is to come. It's the space between who you were and who you will be. It's the gap between the old and the new self. But how do we recognize when emptiness is destructive and when it is transformative? The difference lies in the intention. Destructive emptiness is the kind you try to avoid, the kind born from fear and escape. The transformer is the one you consciously accept, the one you choose to inhabit in order to hear what it has to say. One is escape, the other is encounter. Jung said that encountering the unconscious is always a risk, but it is the most necessary risk in life. Without it, we will never know who we truly are. Without emptiness, we will never hear the self, the totality of the soul. Emptiness, therefore, is the territory of creation, the cradle of transformation. It is there that the new begins to take shape, and the more you avoid it, the further away it becomes from you. But the more you embrace it, the more profoundly it is reborn. Emptiness doesn't need to be understood, only experienced, because it's not an idea, it's an experience. It is the point at which the human being, for a brief instant, ceases to exist for the world and begins to exist for himself. But what if the emptiness is just the beginning? What if silence is merely preparation for something even deeper, the emergence of the true self? What if absence is not the end of presence but the birth of a new identity? These questions remain open, like half-open doors in the corridor of consciousness. Behind them lies the mystery of who we are when the noise ceases. And it is through these doors that we will now enter, into the next part of the journey, where silence becomes a mirror, and the hidden self begins to awaken. There's a quiet, subtle moment in life, when everything that seemed solid begins to dissolve. The people around you remain the same, the work is the same, the routine follows the same rhythm, but inside, something changes. You wake up and realize that nothing satisfies you in the same way anymore. Conversations seem shallow, promises lose their luster, achievements seem repetitive. It's a different kind of emptiness than the one silence provokes. It's the emptiness of someone who begins to sense that the life they've lived so far may not have truly been theirs. Carl Jung called this phenomenon the beginning of the individuation process, the birth of the true self. He said that this awakening almost always begins with a collapse, with the feeling that the old self no longer fits. Is when the persona, the mask we use to adapt to the world, begins to crack, and what hides behind it begins to demand space to breathe. But how is this mask created? From an early age, we learn to mold who we are to fit the gaze of others. We learn that being accepted is more important than being authentic, that pleasing others is safer than being true to ourselves. And so, little by little, we drift away from ourselves. We create versions of ourselves to please, to work, to love, to be noticed. Each of these versions keeps us moving, but distances us from our center. Jung said that modern man suffers from over-identification with the persona. He believes he is the mask. He lives for the role he plays and not for the being that inhabits him. The persona is useful but dangerous. It is what allows social interaction, but it is also what imprisons us in the theater of approval. According to Jung, most people die before they are born to themselves. They die being the character without ever having known the author. But there is always a moment when the soul begins to resist. It's a subtle, almost imperceptible sign. It can manifest as unexplained tiredness, as a weariness with one's own routine, or as a strange feeling that one is living someone else's life. The body continues on, but the spirit has already begun to depart. Interestingly, modern studies confirm this psychological cycle. Research from Stanford University has shown that about 70% of people, at some point between the ages of 30 and 50, go through an authenticity crisis, a phase in which they deeply question who they are, what they do, and why. Scientists call it the midlife transition. Jung called it the call of the soul. The difference lies in the perspective. For modern psychology, this is a problem that needs to be solved. For Jung, it is an invitation to be accepted. Individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are, not who you've been told you should be. And this path, Jung said, is neither linear nor comfortable. It demands detachment, confrontation, silence, and courage. But where does it all begin? It starts when you start saying no. The first step to discovering who you are is to reject what you are not. No is the seed of self-knowledge. The story of one of her patients powerfully illustrates this. A woman, around 40 years old, came into his office saying she no longer knew what she wanted. She had a stable marriage, healthy children, a secure career, and yet she felt a profound emptiness. Jung realized that for years she had lived to fulfill expectations, to be the ideal wife, the perfect mother, the exemplary employee. Everything about her was socially acceptable, but nothing was genuinely hers. He gave her no answers. He only suggested silence, solitude, and a diary. Months later, she returned transformed. She discovered that she enjoyed painting, something she had abandoned in her youth because it was impractical. This simple reconnection with a forgotten desire reshaped her life. Jung used to say, "The human soul cannot bear to be ignored for long. When you remain silent before yourself, it screams." But what is the scream? Sometimes it manifests as anxiety, sometimes as insomnia, sometimes as boredom or depression. The rational mind tries to solve it, but the problem is not mental, it's symbolic. The unconscious is trying to say, "You've strayed from who you truly are." Jung believed that almost all modern illnesses are, to some degree, symptoms of a loss of center. Exhaustion, chronic fatigue, a feeling of emptiness. All of this is the body trying to warn that the soul is too attached to the persona. When we live solely to please others, we leave our subconscious hungry, and the unconscious demands its due. Have you ever felt that no matter what you do, something inside you remains restless? Is it possible that recognition comes but doesn't fulfill you? Is it possible that goals are achieved but meaning doesn't follow? This is the soul asking for space. Jung said that the unconscious always tries to compensate for the excesses of consciousness. If you live too focused outwards, it pushes you inwards. If you identify too much with the mask, it creates cracks that allow the real self to escape. These cracks represent moments of crisis, and every crisis is an invitation to individuation. But few people accept the invitation. Most people flee. Escape by returning to routine, immersing yourself in distractions, seeking new roles to replace the old ones. But the soul is patient. It waits. And the more you run away, the more she calls. There is a powerful metaphor that Jung liked to use: the shadow. The shadow represents everything we deny within ourselves. Our fears, impulses, repressed desires, vulnerabilities, everything we deem unacceptable is pushed onto her. But the shadow does not disappear. She just hides. And when you deny it too much, it returns disguised, as anger, as guilt, as projection. How many times have you criticized in someone else the same behavior that you secretly recognize in yourself? How many times have you hated in another what you most fear seeing in the mirror? That's the shadow at work. Individuation requires the courage to look the shadow in the eye and say, "You are also a part of me." It's a process of integrating, not eliminating. Jung said, "There is no light without shadow, and there is no wholeness without accepting the darkness." But this isn't just philosophy, it's biology too. Studies in neuroscience show that repressed emotions don't disappear. They remain imprinted on the body. Psychologist Peter Levine has demonstrated through decades of research that trauma and emotional denial alter the nervous system, creating real physical symptoms. When you repress a part of yourself, your body bears the weight. Integration is not just spiritual, it's physiological. What if, deep down, the symptoms we call crises are the body's way of asking for reconnection? What if anxiety isn't just an illness, but a call for inner pause? Jung believed that the unconscious is wise. He creates the symptoms not to punish, but to communicate. Pain is the language of the soul when dialogue breaks down. A crisis is the psyche's attempt to restore balance. But the modern world is afraid of pain. She wants to numb everything, solve everything, silence the discomfort, and in doing so, it also silences the message. That is why Jung said that those who try to avoid suffering are running away from their own growth. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by becoming aware of the darkness, he wrote. There is something paradoxically liberating about accepting pain as part of the journey. When you stop fighting it, it transforms. It ceases to be punishment and becomes a guide. It is through contact with the shadow that the true self begins to emerge. But what exactly is the true self? Jung called himself the organizing center of the psyche, the totality of being. While the ego seeks control, the self seeks balance. While the ego wants to be admired, the self wants to be whole. Individuation is the ego's path toward the self. It is the process of returning to one's own center. It's curious that this journey, as old as humanity itself, is rarely experienced consciously today. We live surrounded by stimuli, but disconnected from the soul. And yet, even in the chaos of modernity, the process continues to happen, silently, in every person who allows themselves to question, in every soul that dares to stop, in every heart that says enough to the role that no longer serves. Think of a common example, a 45-year-old executive who, after years of success, feels an inexplicable burnout. He has money, status, respect, But suddenly, none of that affects him. He feels a deep emptiness. What society calls burnout, Jung would call a crisis of individuation. The unconscious, tired of living only for the outside world, forces the collapse. And in the collapse, the space for the self is born. This is the point at which many people's lives change. They leave their careers, move to a new city, and rediscover old passions. But it's not the exterior that changes first. It's the interior. The self begins to reorganize the axis of existence. There is an interesting study done by the Harvard Business Review with over 2,000 professionals who experienced career disruptions. Nearly 80% said that after a period of absence, they discovered talents and interests that had been dormant since their youth. They didn't reinvent themselves. They reunited. What if the same thing could happen to you? What if the feeling of loss you're experiencing now is just the prelude to a deeper discovery? What if, behind the exhaustion, there's a self trying to be born? Jung said that the unlived life is a disease from which one can die. When we live only to fulfill roles, the soul begins to sicken. But when we open ourselves to the unknown, even without guarantees, something extraordinary happens. Psychic energy begins to flow again. Individuation, therefore, is the return of energy to its original owner. It's about ceasing to waste energy maintaining facades and instead investing in authentic growth. It's about ceasing to be what others expect and starting to be what the unconscious wants to express. But this path requires a quiet courage, the courage to disappoint expectations, break patterns, abandon roles. Jung said that no one becomes whole without disappointing the world around them. Individuation is, above all, an act of freedom. However, freedom is frightening, because being free means losing control over how others see you. And that's why most people go back to paper, back to the mask, back to the comfort of approval. But the soul does not forget. She keeps calling, and one day when the noise dies down, you hear it again. The path back to the self is long, but inevitable. It happens silently, little by little, in almost invisible gestures. When you say no to what doesn't resonate, when you choose rest instead of obligation, when you find pleasure in something simple without needing to justify it, when you accept your own shadow without shame, when you allow yourself to be who you are, even if the world doesn't understand. These are the signs that the true self is returning, not as an explosion, but as a memory. The memory of something that was always there, waiting for space. And when that happens, life changes texture. Time slows down. The gaze gains depth. Silence ceases to be a threat and becomes a home. Have you ever felt that calm after an emotional storm, as if something inside you has finally settled down? This is the self taking shape. It's not an end. It's a beginning. But what happens after the true self awakens? How can one live in a world that still values masks, noise, and performance, being someone who now knows the power of pause and inner truth? This is the next crossing. Because, after rediscovering yourself, the challenge becomes different, staying true to yourself in a world that insists on molding you. And it is this new phase, the art of balancing authenticity and presence amidst the chaos, that awaits us ahead. There comes a point in history when the human soul disconnects from itself. It's not something that happens abruptly, but gradually, almost invisibly. First, you start answering messages while eating. Then, you check notifications during conversations. Over time, there is no longer silence, no pause, no emptiness. Every second is filled with a stimulus. Every thought is intercepted by a sound, a screen, an obligation. Little by little, the human being begins to lose the right to simply be. Carl Jung predicted something similar long before the digital age. He said that modern man was becoming a function of society and no longer an individual with his own soul. The danger, according to him, was not the advancement of technology, but the forgetting of the inner self. Jung wrote that civilization progresses outward and forgets to look inward, and that this imbalance generates a subtle form of spiritual illness. We are living within that prophecy today. Hyper-availability has become the new standard. We are always accessible, always visible, always attentive to everything except ourselves. The human mind, which was created to alternate between focus and rest, now remains in a constant state of alert. Recent research shows that the average adult touches their cell phone more than 2,600 times a day. With each touch, the brain releases a small dose of dopamine, the same substance involved in addictive behaviors. These micro-discharges create a subtle chemical dependency, keeping the nervous system in a state of continuous arousal. The result is a generation that is permanently tired, anxious, and scattered, not due to a lack of time, but due to an excess of stimuli. Jung would call this the fragmentation of the psyche. Modern humans live divided between multiple digital identities and social roles, responding to everything and everyone. But what happens when a mind is forced to remain accessible all the time? It falls apart, attention wanes, meaning dissolves. That's why, even surrounded by connections, so many people feel lonely. Modern loneliness is paradoxical. It's not a lack of contact, but an excess of noise. We have never been so connected and, at the same time, so isolated within ourselves. American psychologist Sherry Turkle calls this solitude in a group. We live surrounded by voices, but none of them reach the center. And what's most worrying is that the body suffers as well. Studies in neuroscience show that a constant state of alertness raises levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, and prevents the brain from entering deep sleep modes. Without rest, there is no regeneration. Without regeneration, there is no clarity. But when did we learn that being always available is synonymous with value? Jung said that the need to be present all the time is a reflection of the unconscious fear of not existing. The more fragile the ego feels, the more it seeks to assert itself externally. It's as if it were saying, if I am being seen, then I am real. But that's a dangerous illusion. True presence lies not in being noticed, but in being conscious. Think about how many times you've responded to something without really being there. How many conversations did you have while your mind wandered elsewhere? How many times has he been physically present, but absent from himself? We are experiencing an epidemic of empty presences, bodies connected and souls disconnected. Jung would say that this is a symptom of a civilization dominated by the extrovert, the archetype turned outward, towards the world, towards the gaze of the other. When outward appearances dominate, inner strength weakens. And when the inner self weakens, the soul begins to disappear. But the disappearance of the soul is not a sudden event. He is silent. It starts with small concessions. You give up quiet time to be more productive. You answer messages at night so as not to seem distant. You accept demands that don't nourish you in order to maintain an image of efficiency. And when you realize it, your life no longer belongs to you. You have become what Jung called an inflated persona. An identity constructed to please but empty inside. It's as if modern consciousness has turned into a shop window. We display what we have, we show what we do, but we hide what we feel. The soul, once alive, becomes a spectator of itself, and the result of this is burnout, not just physical, but existential. Studies by the World Health Organization show that burnout is now recognized as a global syndrome. But what we call burnout may simply be the modern form of what Jung would call exhaustion of the soul. It's not just physical exhaustion, but a saturation of the spirit. It is the result of living permanently turned outwards, without time for reflection. If the body is tired, what about the mind? Neuroscience shows that constantly switching between tasks, so-called multitasking, reduces productivity by up to 40%. Every time we change our focus, the brain consumes extra energy to reorganize information. This constant switching prevents deep concentration and creates what William James called poverty of attention. The price of this is the loss of the ability to connect deeply with anything, work, reading, conversation, or even a simple moment of peace. And what happens when a mind can no longer delve deeper? She becomes superficial. Life becomes a sequence of fragments. Nothing is ever fully experienced. But what's most tragic is that we've become accustomed to it. Haste has become a virtue. Distraction has become a habit. The silence became uncomfortable. The void, which was once a field of creation, has become a space to be filled as quickly as possible. Jung believed that overstimulation creates a form of blindness. The soul loses the ability to perceive the sacred in small things. And it is precisely at this point that the disease of civilization begins. When nothing is sacred anymore, everything becomes disposable. Even ourselves. Have you ever noticed how we treat our time the same way we treat objects? We distribute minutes, we sell hours, we rent attention, but we forget that time is the substance of life. Every minute given without awareness is a fragment of the soul that slips away. Jung would say that we live in an age of unconscious sacrifice. We sacrifice our vital energy in exchange for recognition. We have become emotional machines, trained to respond, but incapable of feeling. And the consequence is that the unconscious begins to retaliate. He cannot tolerate the imbalance for very long. When consciousness becomes overwhelmed, the unconscious creates symptoms, and each symptom is an attempt at correction. Anxiety, for example, is the unconscious trying to slow down consciousness. Depression is a call to look inward. Exhaustion is the pause the body imposes when the mind refuses to stop. But what would happen if, instead of fighting these symptoms, we started listening to them? What if every discomfort was seen as a message, not as a failure? Jung viewed mental illness as a healing process in disguise. He said that the psyche organizes itself towards wholeness, and therefore creates imbalances to get our attention. The problem is that, in trying to silence the symptom, we also silence the learning process. The solution, then, is not to fight against fatigue, but to understand what it is trying to tell you. Perhaps he is asking for silence. Perhaps burnout is simply the unconscious mind's way of saying, go home. But what does returning home mean in a world where everything demands availability? It means regaining the right to be absent. Being absent doesn't mean being irresponsible. It's about being human. Imagine for a moment how transformative it would be if society normalized rest, silence, and introspection. If, instead of measuring value by productivity, we measured it by conscious presence. If absence were seen not as weakness, but as wisdom. There are cultures that preserve this logic. In Japan, for example, there is the concept of and, which means the space between things. In art, in music, in life, the and-it is the interval that gives meaning to the form. Jung would certainly have loved this word, because it translates what he always taught. Value lies not only in what is said, but in what is left unsaid. But how do you apply this in a world that demands immediate answers? Perhaps the first step is simple. Learn to delay your response a little. Don't answer everything right away. Allow absence to become part of life's rhythm again. Silence is the fertile ground where the mind regenerates. Emptiness is the resting place of the unconscious. Without them, the psyche becomes ill, and there is proof of that. Researchers at Harvard University have found that people who practice short periods of daily silence, between 10 and 15 minutes, experience a 20% increase in focus and a significant reduction in stress levels. The brain needs these breaks to process and consolidate memories. Absence is, quite literally, what makes us more aware. But there's something deeper here. When we start creating spaces of unavailability, something changes in the way others perceive us. Absence creates respect. Limits create value. Silence inspires presence. And paradoxically, the more selective we are with our attention, the more present we become when we choose to be. This is the principle of scarcity in action, but elevated to a spiritual level. It's not just about being valued by others, but about rediscovering the value of one's own life. To understand that always being available isn't generosity, it's self-neglect. And true love, whether for oneself or for others, cannot spring from a weary soul. Conscious emptiness is the opposite of lack. He is the pause where the being is renewed. It is the space where the spirit breathes and the body aligns. He is the one who allows the ego and the self to communicate again. Carl Jung said, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." But to look inside, you have to close your eyes to the world for a moment. It takes courage to say, "Not now." That simple phrase, "not now," is an act of liberation. It marks the boundary between what the world demands and what the soul needs. And perhaps that's what we lack most today, the courage to be invisible for a while. It's about leaving the stage, leaving the noise behind, and reclaiming the right to silence. Because it is in this silence that we rediscover what we lost in the rush: real presence, mindfulness, an awakened soul. The future perhaps belongs not to those who know how to connect fastest, but to those who know how to disconnect wisely. Conscious absence will be the new luxury, and inner time, the new wealth. But the question is, can you be absent without feeling guilty? Can you disconnect without feeling like you're disappearing? Can it exist without being seen? These questions are the true test of the modern soul, because only those who learn to consciously disappear are able to return transformed. And it is this journey, from excess to essential, from automatic presence to conscious absence, that marks the beginning of the final reunion with who we are. The noise of the world will never cease on its own. It is you who must choose silence. And when you choose, you will realize something extraordinary. Silence has never been empty. It has always been waiting for you. There comes a moment in life when everything we've learned ceases to be mere knowledge and transforms into a calling. That's the moment when words need to become action, and ideas need to be embodied in real experience. What you've lived through so far, what you've heard, what you've felt during this journey, about absence, silence, individuation, and the rediscovery of your true self, is not just theory. It's a seed, and every seed needs soil, time, and a decision to flourish. Carl Jung said that the greatest privilege in human life is becoming who you truly are, and this process, so simple in appearance, is the most challenging of all. Not because the path is inaccessible, but because it requires the courage to stop. It demands the strength to swim against the current of the modern world, which screams at you to hurry, expose yourself, connect, prove yourself, all the time. Jung warned, haste is the enemy of the soul. And perhaps today this is the greatest inner battle of humankind, to reclaim the right to live at one's own pace. But how do we put all of this into practice? How can we move beyond the realm of ideas and apply the wisdom of silence, absence, and conscious scarcity in our daily lives? The first step is recognize where you are getting lost. Ask yourself, in what areas of my life am I being overly available? Perhaps it's at work, where he answers messages outside of working hours and confuses productivity with personal value. Perhaps it's in relationships, where she accepts everything so as not to disappoint anyone. Or perhaps it's in your own mind, which can no longer stop thinking. The transformation begins when you recognize where the excess is draining your vital energy. The second step is to create small zones of intentional absence. It's not necessary to disappear from the world, just to choose conscious pauses. Start with something simple. Set aside a daily time to completely disconnect. Reduce notifications, decrease the flow of visual stimuli. Walk without your cell phone. Listen to the sounds of the world. Breathe. Allow boredom to return. These moments are not a waste of time. They are an investment of the soul. Recent research from Stanford University has shown that practicing short periods of silence, even as little as 5 minutes, significantly reduces activity in the limbic system, the area of the brain responsible for anxiety and emotional overload. Silence literally heals. It reorganizes the inner chaos. Emptiness, when experienced consciously, is not the absence of life. It is the space where life is reborn. The third step is define clear boundaries. Jung said that boundaries are the outline of the soul. Without them, we lose our form. Let others know when you will be available, and more importantly, when you will not be. At first, you will feel guilty. That's natural. But you will soon realize that respect is born from clarity, not from unconditional surrender. Every time you say no to something that drains you, you are saying yes to your own integrity. The fourth step is relearning to wait. We live in the age of instant gratification, instant pleasure, and urgent results. But the soul has a different time. The unconscious works at an organic pace, like nature. Nothing blooms on the same day it is planted. Waiting is not an obstacle. It is part of the process of inner maturation. Therefore, don't rush to fill the void when it appears. Let him reveal himself. Sometimes, silence holds answers that words could never reach. The fifth step is rediscovering the meaning of presence. Strategic absence is not escape, it is strengthening presence. When you withdraw from your studies, you return with greater clarity. When she is silent, her words gain weight. When it becomes selective, its presence transforms into a symbol. People will remember not only what you said, but the energy you carried when you were there. Whole, awake, true. This is the paradox that Jung explored so much. The further we distance ourselves from the noise, the more deeply we connect with what is essential. And the essentials are always simple. To love, to create, to rest, to breathe, to exist. There is nothing more complex and, at the same time, more natural than that. But to experience what is essential, one needs the courage to detach oneself from what is superficial, courage to lose control, courage to let the world go on without you for a while. And contrary to what it seems, the world will continue. But when you come back, you'll realize that it was you who changed. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It is a silent, constant, and profoundly human task. Jung believed that the unconscious is not an enemy to be conquered, but an ally to be listened to. Therefore, the plan is not to fight against the modern world. It is to create an inner space that the world cannot invade. You don't need to run away from society. Just choose when and how you will be present. Imagine the following scenario. You start your day in silence, without looking at your phone, just breathing. He drinks his coffee calmly, observing the movement of the sun. During work, set aside periods for total focus and periods for genuine rest. At the end of the day, instead of getting lost in screens, you write down what you felt, what you learned, what you realized. In a short time, something subtle changes. The mind slows down, the body relaxes, and emotions stabilize. You begin to notice details that previously went unnoticed. The sound of the rain, the smell of the air, the touch of hands. Time ceases to be the enemy and becomes territory. And it is in this territory that the soul awakens. This is the beginning of a symbolic life, as Jung called it. A life guided by meaning, not noise. A life where work is expression, love is choice, silence is presence, and emptiness is power. But you might be wondering, where to begin, practically speaking, right now? Here's one integration plan, simple, direct, and achievable. 1. Create a daily ritual of silence. Set aside 10 to 15 minutes each day just to be in complete silence. No music, no conversation, no stimuli, just you, your breath, and the presence of the now. 2. Choose one day of the week for the availability fast. On that day, reduce your use of technology and avoid responding to messages immediately. Let the world wait for you. This small gesture reshapes how people perceive your value. 3. Reassess your connections. List the people, activities, and commitments that drain you and those that nourish you. Reduce what drains you and get closer to what nourishes you. The quality of your relationships defines the quality of your energy. 4. Establish sacred times. Have moments in the day when you are untouchable. It can be in the morning, before work, or at night, before bed. During these times, do what nourishes your being. Read, meditate, walk, create, breathe. 5. Transform emptiness into creation. Whenever you feel a sense of emptiness, instead of seeking distraction, create something. Write, draw, sing, cook, organize, contemplate. The unconscious speaks through art and creative gesture. 6. Embrace the slow pace. Do something slowly every day. Walk slowly, eat slowly, speak slowly. Slowness is the natural pace of consciousness. 7. Observe your thoughts without fighting them. When your mind starts to wander, just observe. Let the ideas pass by like clouds. The goal is not to control thought, but to recognize that you are not thought. These practices, when maintained consistently, produce something extraordinary. They recreate the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. And it is on this bridge that the true self walks. Jung said that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. This is the essence of the process, to experience the mystery of oneself with curiosity and patience. Allow the silence to speak, the absence to teach, and time to heal. And when you start living like that, the outside world changes, not because it becomes lighter, but because you become more whole. Anxiety gives way to presence. Urgency gives way to serenity, and life, for the first time, regains texture, depth, and flavor. This transformation is individual, but its impact is collective. Each person who regains inner balance changes the atmosphere around them. A peaceful mind radiates peace. A centered heart inspires balance. The silence of one individual can be the beginning of healing for a generation. That's why what you do with your time matters. Every pause you create is an act of resistance. Every limit you set is an act of wisdom. Every time you choose silence over noise, the whole world becomes a little more human. Carl Jung said, "He who looks outside dreams, but he who looks inside awakens." Perhaps this is the moment of your awakening. Not a sudden, mystical, or spectacular awakening, but a slow, serene, profoundly human awakening, to finally wake up to oneself. And when that happens, everything will make sense. Absence will no longer be a source of fear. Silence will no longer be empty, and solitude will become freedom. You'll realize you were always whole, just distracted, and the way back was never out there, but here, now, inside you. The journey doesn't end here. It only begins the moment you decide to apply what you felt, not as an obligation, but as an act of self-love. If these words resonated with something within you, if they touched a point that silence has been trying to reach for a long time, this is your sign to continue. Keep seeking silence, keep practicing absence. Continue cultivating the inner space where your soul can finally rest and flourish. And remember, you are not alone in this search. Many people around the world are waking up to the same need, to live with more meaning, presence, and truth. Therefore, if this journey made sense to you, if it inspired you to rethink your pace and your way of being in the world, I want to invite you to continue walking with us. Sign up now for channel name to be part of this community of reflection and inner growth. Please like this video so that this message reaches more people who, like you, are ready to reconnect with what is essential. And if you wish, share your experiences, questions, or discoveries in the comments, even anonymously. Every word you leave here can be the beginning of a new conversation, a new awareness, a new soul awakening. You've already taken the first step. You've allowed the silence to speak. Now it's time to walk with him. Because absence, when embraced with love, ceases to be a loss and becomes the place where the true self begins to be born.